Good morning, bon matin, et merci d'être ici avec nous aujourd'hui.
Good morning, and thank you for being here with us today. I'm Tyler McCann, Executive Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute.
The need to make progress towards reconciliation has been in the news this week. I want to acknowledge that I join you from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation, Region 3, and all people who make their homes in Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. Today, when we think about what the census tells us of agriculture today, we should also reflect on the peoples and nations who have come before. Statistics Canada recently released the results of the Census of Agriculture, which provides a snapshot of Canadian agriculture in 2021. The snapshot serves as an important benchmark for key indicators of the state of agriculture, updating our understanding of the number, regional distribution, and other characteristics of farms and farm operators, the commodities they produce, as well as the technologies and practices they use. We're excited to host today's webinar, which will explore these results, hear from several leading sector experts on what the numbers tell us about the past and present, and what they mean for the future of agriculture and food in Canada. We will start first with Sébastien Larochette-Côté from Statistics Canada, who will set the stage for us with key highlights from the 2021 Census of Agriculture. Sébastien's opening presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with three experts. During the webinar, we ask that you please submit your questions using the Q&A function on your screen, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Now, I'd like to introduce Sébastien before his presentation. Sébastien Larochette-Côté is the Assistant Director of Agriculture Division at Statistics Canada. Prior to being nominated in his current position, Mr. Larochette-Côté held a number of roles within Statistics Canada, including Editor-in-Chief of the corporate publication Insights on Canadian Society and Chief Researcher who authored several studies on retirement income security, wealth, self-employment, and the labor market. Mr. Larochette-Côté holds an MA in Economics from Laval University and an MA in International Relations from Carleton University. Sébastien, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, bonjour tout le monde.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today.
For the organization of the webinar, I would like to thank also all the organizations that are participating today. But I would also like to thank the farmers and several of which may be represented by your respective organizations. I really want you to pass on the message that their participation to the census, but also to all of our statistical programs is truly, truly important to us. And that's one of the reasons why we've been successful this year in collecting, disseminating information from the Census of Agriculture. So I just want to say again, thank you, thank you, thank you. So today, before we start on the presentation, I just want to provide you with a few key takeaways from the results. 3 words, in fact. The first one is resiliency. You will see that most of the numbers remain relatively stable if you compare with 2016 numbers in terms of major livestock and in terms of acreage. The other word is industry consolidation. So we do see numbers that will probably be quite surprising to some of you. In terms of the extent to which the industry has consolidated over the past 5 years. And I'm going to get back to that in a moment. And the third is modernization and the extent to which we do see movement in terms of sustainability practices. Now, if we can put on the presentation. So this year, we really put emphasis on multiple ways to access CAG information. So we've used all the dissemination tools we have in the toolbox. So this is an invitation, in fact, to visit our website because we have a lot of different ways to access information. The first is the Census of Agriculture portal, which is where you can find all the information, really. But I would also invite you to look at the provincial and territorial profiles, which was released in June last month. We have a profile for each province and also a profile for the North. We also released the CAG community profile. So what this is this is a tool where you can type the name of your community and it will provide all the information. You can compare also with another community with all variables that are produced in the Census of Agriculture. So we think it's really neat. Another way for you to access information quickly, rapidly, and effectively for your respective community. So I invite you to have a look at that. And finally, we have also a mapping tool, which showcases not only data from the 2021 census, but also from 2016. So you can, you select any variable you want, and it's a nice mapping feature that we developed, which is completely new this year. So we're quite proud of that, and you can choose any way you want now to examine the trends with respect to agriculture data. Next slide, please. So to let me talk a little bit about the context, and many of you probably know this, but quickly, agriculture is a profitable export-driven industry in Canada. We were among the industry that experienced the fastest growth during the pandemic. There was a 15% increase in farm cash receipts in 2021. This is creating opportunities, but farmers also face a number of challenges, which include rising costs of inputs, rising international challenges, supply chain problems, labor issues. So times are relatively difficult. There are opportunities, but there are also challenges as well. So we're aware of that. Climate change events are also quite present in the minds of Canadian farmers, and this relates to all the resiliency and sustainability practices that I will talk about in a moment. 2021 was the year of the drought in Western Canada and the flood in BC, although both of these events took place after the census. I just want to make that clear. The census was collected in May. These events took place in later in the year, so which is why they will probably not be reflected in the estimates. But we're also aware of the fact that climate change is a significant issue in the industry. COVID introduced supply chain challenges, but for the most part in 2021, we're relatively better, relatively speaking. In 2020 especially, there were a lot of challenges related to temporary foreign workers, for example. And these issues, for the most part, had been, or at least were on a way to being resolved in 2021. And Canadians are increasingly concerned about local food and a desire to understand where their consumption is coming from. So this is the lay of the land, I guess, what we had in mind when we did the analysis of our variables. Next slide, please. So in terms of the total number of farms, it did decline. This is not necessarily a surprise. This is, this is something that we've seen in previous census cycles, but the difference is that the decline has not been as quick or as steep as in previous census cycles. So a decline from 193,000 farms to 190,000. And we do see that 65% of operations can be found in 3 provinces, Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan. Next slide, please. Oilseed and grain farms remain the largest category of farms. That was also the case in 2016. So in terms of numbers, 34%, 1/3 of all farm operations in this country fall in this category of farms. But we did see, if you compare with 2016, an increase in the number of beef and feedlot farms, and also an increase in the number of farms classified as oilseed and grain as well. We did see also a large decline in the number of dairy and milk farms, in large part because of what's happening in Ontario and Quebec. Next slide, please. In terms of total farm area, we do see a decline of 3.2% relative to 2016. That is not, but that was also accompanied by an increase in the total area of field crops and hay. That increase was relatively small, 0.3%, Okay, but that is not a trend that is completely a surprise, which was also seen in 2016. So we did see a decline in total farm area and an increase in the total area of hay and field crops as well in 2016. Canola remains the top crop in terms of area, and that was also the case in 2016. And that is despite a ban from China that restricted exports in the 2 years preceding the census. Next slide, please. So if you look at the long-term trends, there has been a shift towards oil seed. If you look at the charts to the right, and the red line, which shows the proportion of field crop that is dedicated to oil seed and grain, and pardon me, oil seeds, and that has been at the expense of wheat as well as hay. And the others that are, and there's a couple for other types of crops. So we see more of a small increases, for example, in the case of pulses, but that is the, what's happening. And it will be interesting to see what will be happening in the future as the international situation is now quite different. Next slide, please. As I said before, livestock numbers remain relatively steady. If you look at cattle, for example, we do see that there were 13 million heads of cattle in this country in May of 2021, 15 million in terms of the number of pigs, chicken, 152 million heads, all of which have increased. One area where we saw a small decline was for sheep, a decline of 0.2% since 2016. We do know, however, that these numbers might have been affected by supply chain issues, for example, because we know that in 2021, a few meat packing plants temporarily closed. So it's not impossible that farmers had to keep a few more heads of livestock on their operations, and which might have inflated a little bit those numbers relative to 2016. But by and large, the message is it did not collapse, right? I mean, if you compare to 2016, the numbers remained relatively steady over time. Next slide, please. So the next few slides will talk about consolidation, and this is another example, right? We're looking at the total number of farms reporting beef in this slide, right, which is the line, and that has been declining again. Looking at 2021, not by much in terms of beef, but the total number of heads of cattle increased. So that is a standard story you see all the time, regardless of where you look at. There are always signs of consolidation like that. The beef industry is this complex industry, of course. There are several operations running smaller activities, but that's the main message. Declines were seen in all provinces except in Alberta and Saskatchewan, which we found interesting. Next slide, please. So hogs and pigs, this is an area where concentration in fact, is increasing even more. As you can see, the number of operations decline, but a significant increase of close to 5% in the number of pigs. And the pigs per farm, on average, you have an increase of 300 heads of pigs per operation, which is significant, right, since 2016. So really a move towards larger operations in that industry, which is concentrated in Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba. Next slide, please. Food production, we did see stability in that area, and that is despite the fact that this is a very labor-intensive industry, right? And so we saw an increase, a small increase in the total area of fruits, berries, and nuts between 2016 and 2021, 0.4%. The total area for vegetable decreased by 3%. We know that, again, I mean, the food production, vegetable production, largely concentrated in Quebec, Ontario, and BC, and also in some eastern provinces as well. So all this to say that things remain relatively stable in this area as well. Next slide. Greenhouses is another example where we do see evidence of concentration. The total acreage increased by 23%, which is quite significant. But at the same time, the number of farms classified as greenhouses declined by close to 20%. So that is quite striking in terms of trends. Ontario and British Columbia still accounts for the majority of greenhouses, okay? But we do see evidence of the industry growing in other parts of the country. And that includes Quebec, where we do see large operations popping up in that province. Just a word about cannabis information, which we intend to release later this year. So we did collect information about cannabis operations in this country. The information we will provide should in fact mostly focus on acreage and potentially other variables, but we're still evaluating what variables will be published later this year with respect to cannabis operation. Next slide, please. So farm consolidation continues also in terms of the finances. And this is another interesting fact that more than half of farm operating revenues are in farms that are in the largest sales class category, which is $2 million and above. And that number was 42% in 2016. So we do see evidence of concentration also on a financial front. Number of paid employees on farms declined by 13.7%. Most of the paid employees are also working on large operations, which will not surprise you, but the trend has been changing fast. 63%, close to 2/3 of all paid employees are working on operations that reported at least $1 million in revenues. And that is up from 47% in 2016. So that's quite significant in terms of change over just 5 years. Next slide, please. And we also published information on expense to revenue, the ratio of expenses to revenue. If you look at the total, which is 83 cents for each dollar, 83 cents of expenses for each dollar of revenue, this hasn't changed since 2016. However, there are differences between industries. If you look at the industry that have the highest ratios, you have to look on the livestock, on the side of livestock. Oilseed and grain farms reported the lowest expenses to revenue ratio. Next slide, please. As I said before, at the beginning of this presentation, farms are moving towards renewable energy production, more sustainable practices. Let me just give you the example of the number of farms that reported renewable energy production. This increased by quite a lot, from 10,000 farms to 23,000 farms reported at least one form of renewable energy production, which is quite significant. Ontario had the largest proportion of farms reporting renewable energy production. That's not in this province that we saw the largest increase, however, over the course of the last 5 years. We have other provinces, Manitoba being a case in point, where we saw large increases in the number of operations reporting renewable energy practices. It won't be a surprise if I tell you that solar panels are the most frequently reported form of renewable energy production in 2021. The number of farms that reported that form of renewable energy production jumped by 66.5%, increased in all of the provinces. But we do see other forms of renewable energy production that are also gaining ground, okay, which include geothermal energy systems, bioenergy, that kind of stuff. This land sustainability practice is also on the rise, regardless of which one you're looking at. We did see significant increases everywhere. 65% in 2020, which is the reference year for this question in the census questionnaire. 65%, 2/3 reported at least one sustainable land practice in 2020. Next slide, please. Technology is also on the increase. That the comparisons with 2016 in this particular case are a little bit more difficult to do because we did bring changes to the questionnaire for technology questions. However, for the ones that we could compare, we did see increases. For example, if you look at automated guidance steering equipment, more than 1/4 of farm operations were using this, and that is a 28.2% increase since 2015. Same thing for GIS mapping systems. The use of that increased by 59% since 2015. Same for acres of irrigated land. We did see an increase in that department as well. So more technology, more irrigation taking place on Canadian farm operations. Next slide, please. Farmers also use increasingly direct sales as a method of of selling to consumers. The proportion of farms that use direct sales method went up from 12.7% in 2015 to 13.6% in 2020. That was a pandemic year, which is good because it allows us to see what happened. But now it did increase by 1 percentage point. The increase was stronger if you look at certain types of farms. Vegetable and melon farms were the ones that were most likely to report direct sales. That's not a surprise, but the proportion of those of these types of farms that reported direct sales went up from 50 to 52%. So a bit of a faster increase for these types of farms. Because these types of farms are more concentrated in certain provinces, that's why you do see all the differences on the right-hand side of the slide, with provinces like Quebec and eastern provinces, the Maritimes and Newfoundland and Labrador, reporting the largest proportion of farm operations using direct marketing techniques, and BC as well. Next slide, please. The high value of land is also an issue that we saw in the census in 2021. The increase in the total value of land and buildings since 2016 was 23%. And that is in real terms, in real 2021 dollars. And so that is significant, of course. And we do see that, if you look at the map, that there's, of course, the value is unequal if you look across the country. The areas around Vancouver and Kelowna, as well as some areas around Toronto and Montreal, that's where you can find the farms that have the land that have the most value, which is not necessarily a surprise, but also is becoming an increasingly interesting policy issue. Next slide, please. Another issue that has implications for policy is the aging of farmers. The trend continues. This is not something new, but the numbers continue to be more and more impressive. And if you look at the proportion of farm operators that are aged at least 55, well, 61% that are aged at least 55. And if you look at the regional differences, there are many interesting trends as well. I mean, the oldest agricultural regions can be found in the Atlantic. The oldest one is Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. The youngest one can be found in the West, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So the issue is also in the East that these regions are facing a shrinking tax base and lower immigration rates, which raises questions as to who is going to replace these operators in the future. Next slide, please. However, on the bright side, we do see more women in terms of both their number and their proportion increase. If you look at the proportion of total farm operators, we do see a higher proportion of them that are women. However, women tend to be more concentrated in smaller operations, which is also interesting. We will be releasing a study about women in agriculture, which we hope will be released during the year in the fall. We are also working on a linkage with the Census of Population, which will provide more information on the socioeconomic characteristics of farm operators. But so that is not ready yet. It will be over the course of 2023. But if we look at the information that we were able to retrieve from 2016, we did see that close to 2% of farm operators reported an Indigenous identity, and close to 9% of farm operators were immigrants. So I'm really curious to see what these numbers will be for 2021. And we will be also adding a few additional variables to that to try to get a more complete portrait or profile of the socioeconomic characteristics of farm operators. Next slide, please. So what's next and what to keep an eye on? Essentially, starting this fall, we want to release additional studies on farm and farm operators data in a publication that is called Canadian Agriculture at a Glance. September 2022 is when we plan to release cannabis data, but that is if everything goes well, of course. In December 2022, we will be releasing another data set that is based on the Census of Agriculture, which is called the Agri-Environmental Spatial Database. And I know that some organizations are waiting for this, so we're planning to release that soon. In May of 2023, this will be the release of the socioeconomic characteristics of farm operators, as I said, based on a linkage with the census of population. I just want also to say a word on consultations for the 2026 content. We have a web page. If you can access the web page of the Census of Agriculture on the Statistics Canada web page, you can register for that. And I really encourage you to be part of it. And if you want to be part of the consultation, you need to register. The webpage explains how to do that. Your feedback is important to us. As you can see, the industry is changing. This is moving quickly, shifting a lot. So how can we best address the need for information? That's really so, which is why these consultations are really important to us. And you will be contacted if you register in the fall on how we can collect your feedback for content. So I will stop there. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your question.
Merci, Sébastien. Thank you very much. As you said,
thank you, Sébastien.
This information is very useful, and there is a great deal of it available. And look forward to bringing in now our panelists to look at that, to start to dive deeper. We have several questions that have come back in. Thank you to Sébastien's team for starting to answer those in the chat. We'll come back to some more of the technical questions later on, but now we'll switch to our panel discussion. I will introduce each panelist, and I'm going to ask them first to answer the one common question. In all of this large number of data that's available, what is one statistic or fact that has stood out to you? Why do you think it's important? What do you think it means for agriculture and food in 2022? Our first panelist that will answer that question is Dr. Ellen Goddard. Ellen has been professor and cooperative chair in agriculture marketing and business at the University of Alberta since December 2000. Over the past 30 years, Dr. Goddard's research has focused on the economic modeling of domestic and international markets for food products for policy analysis. Her current research includes various aspects of food behavior, including consumer response to food safety incidents, consumer interests in labels, demand for credence attributes, traceability, and certification. Ellen, thank you for joining us. What's one statistic that's stood out for you?
Thanks very much for having me. I really enjoy this. And I'm also a data hog. So I love when the census comes out because I can't resist trying to dig into it and see what interesting things are there. I have two really interesting statistics that I want to talk about. But the first one, and you can cut me off then, is I'm always looking for the synergy between different pieces of the data that was presented. And we always worry about the aging of farmers. That's one of the statistics that gets picked up in the press that is of significant concern in the sector, that gives us a focus on succession and other things. But when you marry that to the increase in land prices over time, it's clear that land prices become a barrier to entry to certain types of farmers. But in the statistics that Sébastien presented, there were some regional differences in the aging profile of farmers. And there seemed to be some provinces that were having bigger increases in younger participation in farming. So I'm really intrigued if we can do further research in the future to find out how that's linked to various regional programs that are built in place to support younger farmers. if you just go into Google and stick it on and say support for younger farmers, you find that Manitoba has quite a few programs listed, and maybe that partially explains why they're maybe having younger farmers going into agriculture in Manitoba. The other thing is, though, when we talk about the older farmer, I think we still have in our head one farmer, usually wearing overalls, usually a white man, and these farms are getting bigger. These farms right across the country, right across sectors are getting bigger. They're not really managed by one person anymore. And we need to find a way of describing the management team, I think, a little bit more broadly, and that may pick up even more diversity in who's managing our farms in the future. And maybe I'll stop there.
Well, I'm curious. So, what's the second statistic, or what's the second?
Well, the second statistic I was really fascinated by, and I must admit I hadn't thought too much about it before I saw Sebastian's slides, was the increase in renewable energy production on farms. And I went digging around a little bit, and in terms of a little bit earlier data reported by OECD for all the OECD countries, there's quite a significant increase in energy use on farms. So that increase in renewable energy may not be a substitution for traditional, conventional energy sources. It may be where farms are bringing in the new energy that they need to increase their energy use. And I think that would be interesting to know, because it may appear that we're substituting renewable for conventional, and it could be that it's just the way we have to go to add more energy sources to the farm. So I'm really intrigued by that.
Interesting. And I think both of those point to the need to use how we can use the census information as a starting point, but often there's a lot more work that needs to be done to understand what the numbers mean. I'll bring in our second panelist now, Jean-Charles Toupin. Jean-Charles est un conseiller économique en recherche et politique agricole.
Jean-Charles Toupin is an economic advisor in agricultural research and policy at the Union des producteurs agricoles. He has a diploma in farm management and operations from the Institut de technologie agroalimentaire and the bachelor's degree in agroeconomics from the Université de Laval. He's currently completing a master's degree in agroeconomics at the same university. And before working for the UPA, Jean-Charles did a brief stint in agricultural financing and an internship at the Agriculture Division of Statistics Canada. His background allows him to understand the business environment of agricultural producers and the issues they face. So, Jean-Charles, is there any issue that is most interesting for you? Yes, there are two statistics that were very important for us, but I'd like, first of all, to thank Statistics Canada for the tools mentioned by Sébastien, the mapping ones, and the different images we can have. Everything is useful because this enables others, not only agroeconomists, to have access to things, to go through the data, to be able to visualize them. So I really would like to congratulate them for that. Now, as to the data, of course, in Quebec, the increase in the amount of farms, because two provinces had an increase, Quebec and Alberta. In Alberta, it was 2.1, I think. In any event, this was something that impressed us because it's the first increase since 1941 for Quebec. And this increase was in agriculture. And we must understand that in 2016, in agriculture, there were 5 million of contingents, and this increase in farms can be explained mostly in agriculture. And so we can see the impact that joint plans can have and the structure can have. Now, as far as other sectors in Quebec, we saw a move in the amount of farms. For example, 154 farms in big harvest, but it's mostly animals that went in that direction, producers that decide to leave the animals to go to other types of production. And something else that we found to be very interesting is the amount of farms in agriculture. Sébastien talked about it in Quebec. If we compare women, there's an increase of 6.8% of women, 145 farmers. And in the total of farmers in the province, we talk of going from 26 to 27% for women, which is very interesting. And I am interested to see what Statistic Canada want to do with farmers, though this is what we found specifically very interesting. Thank you, Jean-Charles. I'd like to make a follow-up concerning statistics of women that are involved in farms. We already received questions. The census, does it give us the real story? The real implication, rather involvement of women in farms? We know that numbers have increased, but I think that people are curious to know whether it is possible that the rates of involvement are high, but are not really reflected in the census. Well, that's a point that Mrs. Goddard mentioned. Farms are maybe bigger now, but the group is bigger. There's more people involved in the farm. So maybe we want to know what's the management team and to what extent women are involved. So we could see maybe there's more women that would end up being maybe not the owner of the farm, but that are involved in management. So that is an aspect that could be particularly interesting to develop or to make some research on women on agriculture or women managers. I think we will come back to this question later. Thank you.
Al is a member of our team at CAPI, being our research director. He's also research lead and founder of Agri-Food Economic Systems. Previously, Al was the senior research associate at the George Morris Center for 15 years. His areas of research are farm management and agricultural systems, agriculture marketing, and agri-food policies. Al holds bachelor's and master's degrees in agricultural economics from the University of Guelph and a doctorate in agricultural economics from the University of Minnesota, where he was a Fulbright scholar. Al, my question was, what's one statistic that stood out to you? But the other two panelists have both picked two, so I'll give you the opportunity to pick two as well.
Wow. Well, thanks, Tyler. I think the first one I'd like to draw attention to, Sébastien did a very good job of raising it, was the issue of consolidation. And there's one particular aspect, and it appeared in the Daily May 11th when the first census data was released. Sébastien had it in a bar graph, but I thought I would read it because it really struck me. Farms in the top sales classes account for the largest share of total farm operating revenues and a larger scale of total farm employees. For example, in 2021, farms reporting at least $2 million in sales accounted for 51.5% of farm operating revenues. Sébastien illustrated that in his chart. This compared with 41.5% in 2016. In other words, it's up fully 10 percentage points. I think the reason that's important as an element of consolidation is that we're in a position where, as a matter of fact, the production of farm products is actually in a relatively small number of hands, and that's where we've evolved to. But moreover, we have this dichotomy between a relatively small number of farms accounting for a very high proportion of the farm sales, yet most of the farms are small farms. And what is disappearing is what's in between. And the reason that I think that we should worry about that is, well, there's any number of reasons, I guess, but one of the things that we kind of take for granted is agriculture as a community, a commonality of interest. And I worry that over time, the way we're evolving, this is fragmenting, and that affects everything from how we represent ourselves in primary agriculture, the way that we do procurement and marketing on farms, how agricultural policy focuses on households as some of the special status and attention and exceptionalism provided to agriculture. I think this trend is certainly disruptive and maybe worrying in terms of how all that comes together. So that was the first notable statistic. I think the second one, which I won't get into as much detail on, is the general decline in natural grasslands, particularly in Western Canada. I think this is a concern, and I've spoken with my colleague Ellen Goddard about this. She shares my concern. This is a concern from the perspective of biodiversity loss. You have to assume that if natural pasture, particularly in Western Canada, is in decline, it's in decline because it's being converted to cropland. And we have some sustainability concerns, some greenhouse gas emission concerns that are released when natural, pristine grasslands are converted. Those are all concerns that are of current public policy attention. Great. So I'll stop there, Tyler.
Great. Thank you, Al. And so we'll go to some questions for all of the panelists, and I'd like to recognize Sebastien has some colleagues that are joining him here today that have been helpful in answering the chat. So we'd like to acknowledge the participation of Leon, Matthew, and Eric, who are from Sebastien's team. Thank you very much. And again, they've been good at answering some questions that have come up. So this is a question that I'd like to start off and builds on some of the points that have been made earlier. And maybe Sebastien, I will ask you to speak to this first. Statistics Canada changed how it defines a farm in Canada as part of the modernization of its agriculture statistics program. In 2021, a farm or an agricultural holding now refers to a unit that produces agricultural products and reports revenues or expenses for tax purposes to the Canada Revenue Agency. Previously, a farm was defined as an agricultural operation that produced at least one agricultural product intended for sale. Now, again, we'll start with, I think it's interesting to note that for the first time we see a class of farmers. We have 8,000 farmers in Canada that declared $0 of agriculture revenue, and that's I think as a result of this change. But Sebastien, I was wondering if we could start with you. What drove this change, and what difference do you think it makes? And we'll go to the other panelists to discuss this after.
Question. Thanks for the question. Well, there are two reasons really for the change. The first is we wanted to be consistent within the program by using a similar definition, which is based on tax. You said it, and basing it on tax allows us to do all sorts of different linkages. So from an efficiency point of view and from a data replacement perspective, it was the best thing to do because it allows us to get into the BR, the business register, and things like that, and other sources of information that are actually coming from the tax system. And then that reduces the burden or the response burden on farmers, which is something that is very important to us. We don't want to increase the burden on farmers. We want to reduce that burden. So for that, it was a good step in the right direction for that reason. So it does have an impact, a certain impact, especially on the small side of the spectrum. The large operations are still going to be captured, right, by that. So, and because as we said, and we saw that with the industry consolidation, large numbers and are driven by large operations. So, the impact in terms of numbers, if you think of livestock, for example, if you think of acreage, the impact should be relatively small. We did do a backcasting exercise for 3 key variables: sales, operators, and I believe acreage. And we didn't see massive differences, at least at the national level, even for the majority of the provinces. We did not see things moving a lot. That backcasting exercise essentially is a model. The idea is, okay, so if we applied the current definition of the farm to the 2016 data set, what would happen? And at the national level, not much would happen. So we're confident that comparison can be made with the vast majority of the variables. So I'm not saying that things are not completely perfect, right? Because the hobby farms, for example, this is something that we might not capture, okay, with the new farm definition. And if I may add, a third reason also is that precisely if we want this to be a definition that reflects more appropriately the industry from a business perspective, we think that this is the best approach. And so we're moving forward with it. The rest of the agriculture statistics program is also using it. So hopefully that's the one we're going to use again in 2020.
Okay. Thank you. Would other panelists like to comment on this, Ellen?
I was just going to ask, one of the things that you noted in the presentation is that there's more interaction of certain groups of farmers directly with consumers, and I've got some questions about that in the end. But we've also seen a change in where agricultural products or food products are being produced. And it's not broadly distributed through every urban center in Canada yet, but there are some urban centers where there was quite a bit of food production occurring in the cities. Grocery stores putting green stuff on their roofs, hotels raising bees and salads on their roofs, urban farming on vacant lots in the peri-urban fringe around urban centers. The new definition, I'm assuming, won't pick up much of that. So we're not including that group of food producers in the definition. Am I correct?
Well, again, if urban farms report revenues or send a tax signal, it's not only about revenues, right? If they send a tax signal of any kind to the Canada Revenue Agency, they will be included. So there are urban farms in the census if they are reporting as an operation with fiscal information. But you're right. If there's no fiscal signs, if it's a hobby, if it's a hotel that produces vegetables
for itself
on site, it won't be captured.
But the vertical farms that sell stuff probably would.
The vertical, again, I mean, this is a fiscal definition, right?
Yeah.
So we don't pay attention to what the farm does. So we pay attention to the fiscal signals that any type of farm will report. So if a vertical farm, say, for example, grows vegetable or herbs, well, I would assume that they are part of it if they send signals to the Canada Revenue Agency.
Okay.
Thank
you,
Ellen. I would think that your sort of urban or suburban farm that's maybe involved in market gardening or something like that. That's exactly who gets picked up in this, I would think.
Sounds like it.
I guess a couple of observations on it. So I believe the total number of farms was about 189,000 or something like that. You add 8,000, so that's sort of about a 4% or thereabouts differential that you're adding into this. It's interesting where that I looked at where that fragments itself provincially, and it's disproportionately from Quebec, Ontario, and BC. There's another significant number in Alberta, but I think that's probably just a function of the fact that there's a lot of farms in Alberta. And that would be, seems to me, consistent with sort of some of the, relatively small suburban, well, they're obviously relatively small if they're not selling anything, but kind of suburban type farms. It seems consistent with that.
By the way, Al, the provinces that you mentioned also have very strong local food programs, like
Yes.
Foodland Ontario, and some of the other provinces, that's not such a high profile.
Jean-Charles, tes commentaires sur la question de nouveau définition?
Jean-Charles, do you have any comments concerning the definition? Well, as far as the definition goes, Sebastien says they did it for certain variables. And my point was precisely to know whether the exercise was to apply the definition to 2016, because I remember that in the data of 2021, it was mentioned to be careful with the chronological issues of the data. So it would be interesting to know where to pay attention and where the comparison could be difficult. So my suggestions was that Statistics Canada should be the exercise of the comparison, but it's clear that the new definition is clearer, because if we go to the previous definitions before 1996, there was an aspect of amounts that were connected to the definition, and in 1996 or 1991, that was taken away, and now it's being brought back. So I find that the question is clearer. On the other hand, I had certain questions. I was wondering, could this have an impact on that? For example, paid work in agriculture. We saw a change in the statistic from 2016 to 2021. There was a reduction in amount of farmers that have things external to agriculture. So those were my questions, more or less, but I think it's an exercise that's important as far as certain variables go. Sébastien, do you want to add something? No. It's a matter of resources. The questions, we had to do it for the provinces, for the three significant variables. I can't hide to you that we could do it for more variables, but the reason is that there are hundreds and hundreds of variables in a census, and the question is which one to analyze. And we wanted to do the exercise, and we were satisfied with the exercise that shows us that comparisons in general can be made. But we want to be transparent and say that the definition had changed, and although definitions can be made, people have to be aware of the change in definition, reason for which this was used in our distribution. At the same time, Jean-Charles, you are right. It's not the first time definitions for farms are changed. This happened several times in agriculture, which doesn't mean that we cannot do definitions and to see what are the main trends. What happens with bigger farms? So if we look at the amount of farms, for sure, if we look at the amount of farms with less than $2,000, well, you understand what I mean? I think that that's where we should pay more attention. That is to say, I'm also asking people to do this exercise, to make a judgment exercise in a certain way, you understand? I can't guide every person, each analyst, each expert to do this exercise and see whether it is something that can be done or should not be done. But at the level of a national or provincial trends, there's no problem. Thank you.
The census changes every 5 years. You ask new information, you get new results. Ellen, we'll go to you with this first. Your research is focused a lot on agriculture marketing. The census again asked some new questions, got some new details on direct sales and marketing this year. I was wondering if you could just speak generally to what you see. They talked about that slight increase, but that broad variability across the country. What do you think the census has told us about the state of direct sales and marketing in Canada?
a couple of things. First of all, given that this was still in a pandemic period, I was actually surprised that the shift wasn't bigger than what it might have been, but it definitely was bigger in the 2020 period. And by the time we did the census in 21, some things may have adjusted back to more traditional delivery methods. So we may have missed some of that peak, but certainly everybody, for risk reasons and all that business about not having toilet paper in the grocery stores and not having Robin Hood yellow sacks for flour and all that things made people think the more direct their connection could be with farmers, the more secure their food supply was going to be. But by 2021, we'd probably adjusted away from that. So I found that interesting. But I'm also, again, and I'm not trying to find fault or any of those things, but I'm intrigued by the fact that a lot of farmers I know directly contract with restaurants, for example. And I'm not sure if that shows up in direct sales or it doesn't show up in direct sales, and it probably has to do with how the farmer reports it. But the other thing that I noticed a lot that happened with the pandemic is there was relaxation in the major grocery store chains. Traditionally, the grocery store chains had worked on a model of rationalizing purchasing. So there was very little local food appearing in lots of major grocery store chains because the decisions were made nationally. And it seemed to me from the pandemic, and it has sort of remained since the pandemic, that we've relaxed some of those rules at the local grocery store level. So I'm intrigued about whether farmers are actually directly contracting with grocery store chains in urban centers around where they farm or not. And I'm wondering if we're picking up some of that. So I do think there's been a big shift in the interest in local food in a lot of ways, and people wanting to get it conveniently. Some going to a farmer's market in two-hour periods during a week is not necessarily convenient. So we're seeing evolution in how those things work and how that is organized. So there may still be further growth in that into the future. And it's interesting, at some point, even I used to make jokes 20 years ago that you wouldn't want to only eat turnips all winter because of that being the major thing that we could grow and sustain over the winter. But there's an incredible variety. There's an incredible variety of foods available in Alberta now year-round that are providing the seed for growth in that sort of area through greenhouses and other sorts of facilities. But I think it's important that we see the diversity in food arising.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to comment on the direct sales and marketing? Sébastien?
If I may just and then that might be part of the explanation for what you report, Alan. It's that we include sales directly at a market or on farm. It excludes sales of any goods purchased for resale to intermediaries such as marketers and wholesalers, and it also excludes sales directly to a store. So that is directly from the census questionnaire. Okay, so resales to or those types of arrangement to that's not included, right, in the direct sales question. So that's a good point. And we're having conversations with AAFC on that because they also let us know that there is an interest for that kind of information. So I guess I need to stop there, but we're aware of what you're describing. The other thing I wanted to mention is that is also an issue that we want to develop in a paper. So we would like to provide some more information and more analysis on that specific question in the studies to come.
Great. Good. Thank you. Jean-Charles?
Oui, ben, premièrement, par rapport à
Yes, first of all, as far as this question goes, it was modified if you compare it to the previous census, because there are other methods of marketing that were added, and the percentage of revenue that comes from direct sales, that's very interesting, given that the data were a bit broken in this census. So in the next one, we could do a good comparison, but as to the total, we could do a comparison, but as to specific things, there was a reduction in kiosks in the farms, but this is distributed in the different methods that were more representative. But a point that interested me, it's certain that a census is a photo, and this photo was taken during the pandemic. So the reduction in public market was reduced at the national level too, but it's important to indicate that, and maybe the next census will enable us to see whether it was only the pandemic period or whether it's rather a tendency, a trend. Maybe there's direct sales that have to do with it. So I think that public markets were the ones that interested me the most, and we will see what will be the trend in the next few years.
If your research has touched on that question that Jean-Charles raised, do you have a sense of how those marketing channels are changing and whether or not they were a blip because of COVID or represent long-term changes in how consumers are buying food directly from farmers?
Yeah, I think you're asking me that question, Tyler.
Sorry, no, I was asking Ellen that.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah,
but if you'd like to take a stab at it,
I think I'll defer to Ellen on that.
Okay.
Sorry, I missed that. I will say that I do a lot of regular surveys with consumers in Canada, relatively large samples, and I do get an steadily increasing across time percentage of the people who respond to surveys who say they are buying food in some direct way. The one other thing I would say about the pandemic is that food is a very personal thing. So we often have had personal relationships get developed. When people are looking for local suppliers, they have a tendency to know who those people are. And once you've developed a personal relationship, you often don't give that up, even if it becomes slightly inconvenient in the future. So there may be some of those patterns, as Jean-Charles was saying, that are going to be entrenched in the longer term, either through farmers markets or through community-supported agriculture that may remain. What we don't know quite yet is what the proportion is going to be. And we also still don't know how many people are going back to the office. It's a little bit unclear. And if you're not going back to the office, you may like to still have these local personal relationships.
Interesting. So one of those pieces that seems to be becoming entrenched, it was touched on earlier, is the change in how we use agricultural lands in this country. Al and Ellen, or Al mentioned discussions that he and Ellen have already had on the topic. Al, this was one of the statistics that you noted earlier as being a big one. This move away from croplands or move away from grasslands and pastures to croplands. One of the questions that's come in has noted this dynamic that plays out of having to help people understand the impacts of that change. Al, maybe could go to you first on this to dive a little bit deeper. Again, we've seen changes across the country. The statistics get to be quite interesting when you look at where the changes are. What's your sense as to this long-term trend and what it means for Canadian agriculture?
Yeah, so what the census tells us is that the farmed area is in decline. Nationally, I believe Sebastian said it was about 3%. Yet the cropland area is up. So that's going to maybe seem like a contradiction to some people. But the cropland area is a subset of the farmed area. And what I think we're seeing there primarily is probably a reorientation within the farmed area category, in which we have had conversion, particularly in Western Canada, from pasture land into cropland, which is annual crops, or maybe in some cases perennial crops, but cultivated land in any event. Elsewhere, it's also going to be conversion of land that was farmland into urban development or other kinds of uses. But let me just focus on the pasture land here for a moment, and then maybe I'll say a little bit, and maybe then defer to Ellen, because I know she has some ideas on this as well. This is an important issue in terms of Canada, not only meeting, but just simply retaining the fixed carbon that is contained within those grasslands. And we have a lot of ambition as a sector in terms of being a solutions provider for greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change. And it's right to have that ambition, but we also have to think about how we maintain what we already have. And conversion of these lands are detrimental from that perspective. There's also quite a literature discussing biodiversity that occurs in natural grasslands as opposed to managed agricultural systems, and I think that's equally very important. One of the points that Ellen raised a moment ago was the high value of farmland being a barrier to entry, and I think it also enters into this issue of conversion, because there will be some people who have purchased land at a relatively high value that are immediately beset by the need to create as much value from it as possible. And typically that is not going to be the more extensive land uses like pasture. So the pressure comes to develop those pasture lands into annual cropping systems. And even within land that's purchased at a relatively high price, that previously was cropland, it creates pressure to simplify crop rotations, and that's also a worrisome thing from a sustainability perspective. So I think that was a statistic that really stuck out at me, and I think there's a lot more to discuss there and how we address it. But I don't know, Ellen, can I go to you for any other thoughts?
I'll say two things. Leon, by the way, just made a great point in the chat about how when we were collecting data in 21, we'd had the catastrophes that were mentioned in terms of drought in Western Canada and floods in British Columbia. That will have taken some land out of production, possibly temporarily, possibly in the longer term in some of those areas. So that may also explain some of the downturn in land and which land that was. I think Al's right. I'm really concerned that, as was mentioned in a question, that the public get a better handle on the idea that changing land use, even if you can't see it, is having an impact on sustainability issues within Canada. Biodiversity is really important. We used to collect statistics on farmland birds, for example, that don't seem to be collected anymore in Canada. But you can see that the bird life, the insect life, the housing for bees and wild bees, particularly monarch butterflies, all of that will be affected when we change the land use. And I think we may as a society underestimate how much biodiversity was created by maintaining grasslands. So I have to say that. But the other thing that it was interesting that was pointed out in the statistics was that things like livestock production seem to be, beef production in particular, seem to be increasing in Alberta and Saskatchewan and declining in other parts of the country. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, possibly the industrial organizational structure of the meatpacking industry means that we have big slaughter plants in Western Canada, and you might as well raise the cattle closer to the slaughter plants. But we may also have this land that is perceived to be more accessible for some of these aspects. And if we change that land out of pasture into other things, then we're going to get a crossover effect in terms of whether or not beef production will change in certain areas or not. And I think some of that interaction between the production of different types of commodities is not well understood. Remember, though, that canola was seen to be particularly important in terms of value to the agricultural sector and in terms of exports from the agricultural sector. So it's not surprising that canola is putting pressure on other land uses because it's just seen to be so important and a way of sharing some of the fixed costs associated with machinery and other things if we bring more land into canola production.
Jean-Charles, tes pensées là-dessus?
Jean-Charles, what do you think as well? If I may intervene concerning this question, well, what Al and Helen mentioned, it's a dynamic in Western Canada. In Quebec, we see a distribution of different type of lands, but I analyzed data in agriculture in Quebec, and from 2006 to 2011, there was a reduction, and from 11 to 21 is different, and we can see that there are new rules that limit the increase in agriculture in degraded basins. So we can see an effect at the environmental level, and it becomes a limit for a producer. So I find that, yes, it's very important to talk about the change of land use, but I think that the forest is hidden in the sense that there's a loss of 2 million of hectares in Canada, around 134,000 acres in Quebec of land with agriculture for another use, commercial or cities. In Quebec, there's a system where agriculture is protected, but still there's a loss of lands for other uses, and that's an aspect that impacted me in particular, but we can still see that there's a dynamic that's different for agriculture in Quebec in comparison to other regions in Quebec. So the question of agricultural lands that we see is that we are losing value of the lands. In fact, the lands are increasing, and there is a question concerning the connection between the cost of the land and the cost of agriculture. And there's another question on a relay. What do you think, Sébastien? What does this say to us? There's a value increase, and this could be a reason for which we see this transition from pasture at the yearly level. Inaudible, the interpreter apologizes. What do you think? Well, it's sure that as far as land use, the more the value increases, the more producers will go to cultures that are more profitable. If I take a local example for me in Quebec, well, in Montérégie, there's going to be grains, and the producers will go more to corn, and they will leave cereals or hay. So for sure, they're going to change and use it in a more profitable way. Same dynamic could be applied out west. So they're going to change as far as use. But if I could talk now about the impact on transition, it's certain that this is something very important, both for succession, but also the transfer of companies, because the bigger they become, the more complex the transfers are. And in agricultural financing, I see that there are very big companies that become a puzzle as to what to do with them. On the other hand, it's not direct data from the census in Quebec, for example. From 2017 to 2021, we had an increase of 49% in agricultural debt. So there's an increase in assets, at the same time an increase in debt. So it becomes more and more complex. And now there's an increase in interest rates. And every time interest rates increase, there's 50 million less for agriculture. That's in Quebec. In Canada, I think it's 130 billion in agricultural debt. So in this context, where assets are expensive, there's an increase in interest rates. So we need good risk management and to cover new risks that could affect the relay. So that's a little bit what I had to say. Yes.
Earlier, so Jean-Charles just talked about the need for business risk management programs. We effectively have a common set of programs across the country that treat producers relatively equally. That's not the case when it comes to young farmers and farm transition. You talked about how we see in the statistics a different rates of change on young farmers and the age of farmers depending on the province. I think it's an interesting example of how you can do more of that natural experiment where different governments have different policies and it's producing different results. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more again, how we see that these more targeted policies around farm transition are likely driving these different results and different changes that we see across Canada. Ellen, do you want to take? Can you take that one on?
Well, certainly there's lots of evidence that we have quite differentiated programs, particularly targeted at young farmers. Farm Credit, though, does have some programs for young farmers that are sort of consistent across the country. What some of the younger farmers that I have worked with in Alberta feel is a problem is as the farms get bigger and you want to buy something to get started, it becomes a big problem, because essentially what you want is a piece of a farm, not the entire thing with the multi-million dollars invested in equipment and other sorts of things to get started. And we don't have consistent programs across the country that support farms at different scales, I guess, is the best way to see it. And I also think that some of our business risk management programs, when I was working with the Alberta Local Food Council quite a while ago now, we brought in the people that worked with business risk management programs in Alberta, and they said we can only develop actuarially sound risk management programs when we've got a history of revenues and expenses and that sort of thing that suit the scale of the farm or the type of commodity that's being raised in a particular area. And if we don't have that history, it's risky, I guess, to jump into business risk management programs for those sorts of farmers, which means maybe there's something that needs to be done collectively. Farmers at different scales often have some difficulty communicating with established commodity organizations as well, and getting on the board of, or getting their concerns on board for the commodity organizations to handle them in their negotiations around things like the design of policy and programs in the country. Because traditionally, as the industry got bigger and farms got bigger, then there was a commonality in the policy process, and making it more heterogeneous makes it harder for the commodity organizations to negotiate with the government. So there's all kinds of issues around the entry of younger farmers into agriculture that are difficult and costly and take a lot of effort to address. And I guess the more data that we have on this phenomenon, the more clear that will become across time. But I do know that for some younger people, it's even people who come from a history of agriculture, if they're not inheriting something through a family, it's still difficult to enter farming, even though they passionately want to.
And Al, there was a question on this that you had answered in the chat, but this builds into your comments about the loss of the middle class farm in Canada. Effectively, again, this is related to comments Ellen just made about the challenges in farm size and shape and value and how do you get involved? Can you just expand a little bit further on how you see that fragmentation and consolidation playing out?
Yeah, sure. But before I go there, though, I think I think, Ellen, some of your comments around the business risk management side of new farmers and your more sort of idiosyncratic or specialty products. I think that's right, and you're always going to have that challenge with crop insurance. If somebody wants to start growing, lavender in an area that doesn't grow any lavender, you're going to have trouble having an insurance product for that. But like with respect to agri-stability and new producers, we do have a pretty thorough set, not sure about lavender, but a pretty thorough set of benchmark per unit models that we can use with new producers. So I'm not as sure, like with regard to agri-stability, I think that's probably maybe about as well placed as it could be, perhaps. So I think I'd be keeping that in mind. Yeah, going back to this problem of the kind of the hollowing out of the middle of farms. I was really pleased, Sebastian, that I understand that's a special query that Statistics Canada does to provide us with that information, and it's been produced before. I'm glad you're producing it again. It's important because there's a lot of the way we think about ourselves in agriculture that really drives on a notion of maybe not a completely homogeneous community, but a pretty strong sense of community and in terms of how we represent ourselves, commonality of interest, the way we use markets. We depend a lot on liquidity. Well, you've got, as we've just been discussing, you've got smaller farmers that market in a particular way that may be very different from the farm with more than $2 million in sales. So over time, we're perhaps losing that commonality. I think about some of the agribusiness that rely on sort of transactional businesses. The feed dealers, the machinery dealers, suppliers writ large. If a lot of your business model is based on foot traffic, well, that foot traffic, I guess, is coming from the smaller or the medium-sized farm. Probably not so much the large farm, maybe sometimes, but not, when you're at a very large scale, you've got different kinds of relationship with suppliers. So I think all that is, all that factors into how we think about our institutions and how we work together. And maybe one of the great fears I have is that, a lot of the special provisions that in a manner of speaking, provide special treatment or sometimes shield farmers from the burden of regulation and some of the other things that different forms of business have to bear. If you have this evolution over time in which farm businesses appear to diverge from farm households, then I don't know what the argument is for a particular kind of special status that justifies the kind of programming that we have, and much bigger than the discussion of the census, obviously, but the census is a core piece of information that informs this.
Thank you, Al. I'm not going to leave enough time for this. We've got 3 minutes left, but something we haven't touched on that I think is important speaks to what the census tells us about the sustainability of farms in Canada and their adoption of sustainable farm practices. Sebastien talked about on-farm generation. Ellen, I think you mentioned that earlier. Ellen, can I go back to you just around what you think the Census of Agriculture tells us about adoption of sustainable practices on farms in Canada?
I think we're starting to get a much better picture of it as the census evolves. I remember, anyway, doesn't matter, but in the 80s and early 90s, we just weren't getting a picture of what was going on, even with technology use on farms. It was leaps and bounds ahead of where the questions on the census were, and I think we're catching up, which is all very good. The problem with sustainability of farming is that it's constantly evolving, and that's why the census is so important. And I was just thinking when we were talking about shifting land away from pastures to crops and things, as late as when I first moved to Alberta, you wouldn't have seen corn grown in as many places in Alberta or as far north in Alberta as you see it now. So on one side of that, the crop developers are using technology to develop varieties that can be grown in different circumstances. At the same time, we're having some climate change, which is evolving where things can be grown and where things are going to have access to. I guess the other side of it, though, is I find the chart that Sebastien showed about irrigation really scary, because that is tied directly to sustainability of agriculture. I know Alberta shows up predominantly on that chart, and I do think Alberta is the first place where dryness is going to be a major factor. But we have to recognize there are going to be other places in the country where this is going to be a growing situation. We better be doing some of those living labs in Alberta to make sure that we're handling the right water pricing and access policies to make sure we're prepared on that front in the future. I think because we have so many lakes and rivers around, we underestimate the impact that we'll have on agriculture as we get successively drier and hotter in the future. So there's some things that we're picking up out of the census that are showing trends in the right direction. There's some things that we're going to have to get ahead of the game if we're going to try and pick up, if we're matching the census data to the weather records, as well as to the tax records, is going to be important.
Thank you. Ellen, you get the last word for our discussion today. Clearly, that is a much bigger topic that, again, is part of many ongoing dialogues and discussions, and one that we will pick up this fall when CAPI resumes its webinar. I would really like to thank Statistics Canada, Sebastien, and his team for presenting the information, for engaging, for being active in the chat and responding to questions. Thank you to our panelists. Merci, Jean-Charles, Al, and Ellen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Charles, Al, and Hélène.
Showed kind of the breadth of information that's included in the census and what it tells us. Thank you all to our participants for joining us. This has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. We look forward to sending the link. Please share it so others can help can see this deep dive that we went into today. Thank you very much again, everyone, and have a great day.